In this video, what I'm going to do is give you a better understanding of multi-language and how it works inside of Copilot Studio. So let's go discover how this actually works. So let's first dive into where do you actually add new languages inside of Copilot Studio? Well, the answer is that there's a languages implementation that you have to go to inside of the settings of your agent. Just because Copilot Studio supports a bunch of different languages doesn't mean that your agent that you're implementing is going to support that particular language. So for you need to think about if you'd like to add Spanish or French or any of those other additional languages, first things first, you need to make sure you go in and add that language into Copilot Studio. Now, once you've done that, you may think, oh, well, it's automatically going to start speaking in other languages, but that's not really what this is doing at this point. It's just indicating to the agent that you want to support additional languages. And we're going to go through some tips and tricks throughout the week and throughout the different videos that I'm going to be releasing. And you'll get more information on how to be able to leverage this particular setting to be able to be an indicator for you to be able to do more. But just understand, first things out of the box, you need to go in and set this setting if you would like to support a specific language with your agent that you're building inside of Copilot Studio. So the next thing that we want to take a look at is how does Copilot Studio even determine what language to speak to the user when it's being used? And the answer is it's stored in a system variable. It's in the system.user.language variable. And that variable is how it determines what language it's actually going to speak. So when you start looking at this, by default, Copilot Studio is not just going to respond to you based upon the way that you speak to it. It's going to use this setting. So that way, if you're coming in through a web chat or through all these other mechanisms, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to be able to set that from the channel. That's the most common way that we see people do this, is that they proactively say, hey, this implementation is actually in English, and so someone connected through a web chat on the English website through their browser, they'll pass that information in and they'll set that user.language information. Now, beyond that, if I want to start looking at this and I can use that variable throughout my Copilot Studio implementation, that's all great, but I can also go and look at all the different possible options that this variable can be set to. And as I said earlier, you'll see that there's a lot of different options here. Now, what happens if we set that variable to something that we haven't done what I said in the first part, which is what languages you actually want your agent to support? Well, then you're going to get an error, because what's going to happen is Copilot Studio is going to be looking to be able to speak a language, but you haven't added that language in. So just be aware that user.language, which is system.user.language, is where we store the actual setting of what the agent is going to speak at that given time. And then that is a choice selection of a lot of different options, but those options, when you select those options, you should select one that is one that you've already added to your agent. Otherwise, you will get an error. Okay, so now let's talk about how we actually make it where Copilot Studio is not just selecting which language it's going to be configured to use, but how do we actually affect the actual written words or the way that it's going to handle the translation of the content that you're dealing with. Well, there's really two major ways that we can do this. One is going to be that we can do manual translation, and that manual translation allows me to be able to use either something like a regex or a JSON file to be able to say, this is the manual translation that I want to be able to do of this. Now, the other options are machine translation, and the machine translation scenarios, I can choose. I can use a large language model that I want to use to be able to do the translation, or I can use Azure Translation Services. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people choose to go different ways, but it's first important to understand that there are really these two different options that I have available to me between manual translation or machine translation. And it's not a one or the other. They can actually be mixed. So let's dive into the different approaches and why you might do those different approaches. So let's start with manual translation. Why do we see people wanting to do manual translation? And what is manual translation to begin with? Well, manual translation is where I'm going to actually have a human do the real translation of the content. So that way what I can do is I can say, this is exactly how I want it to be translated. Now, why do we see that? It's because they want that control. They want that ability to say, this is exactly how I want to say that. Now, people do this for a lot of different reasons. A lot of the reasons are people don't trust or like the machine translation. And so when they look at it, they go, wait a minute, it really doesn't say it 100% like a real person would say it. You get the gist of what it means. And many of you probably went out and used machine translation when you were traveling, and you can find that it's kind of, people understand what you say, but they're not necessarily saying it that way normally. So again, a lot of times people want to use it because they want to deal with that. The other thing is there's also sometimes where there's different dialects that it's not quite as accurate with machine translation to be able to do this. So they want to manually translate that particular piece. And then the other thing is, just be aware that manual translation is only a function that can be done when you are doing authored responses. So when we're looking at this and we're going to go upload a resx file or a JSON file to make our own custom translation, that is a situation where we can only do that on the things we authored. If we generated that response, we're gonna have to lean in on machine translation. So just be aware that these are different things and different approaches that you need to think about as you start to build your agent. Okay, so now let's talk about why would you want to use machine translation and what are the options here. Now, the first thing to understand is that machine translation is going to be where we are not manually translating the content. We're actually going to use a large language model, or we're going to use like an Azure service to be able to go do this, like Azure Translation Services. And when we decide that we're going to use these things, we're going to do it so that we don't have to support all these different languages by translating every single language manually or paying a translator to go do that for us. So that gives us out of the box multiple languages without the need of that manual translation effort. Now, the thing that we see is that we see translation coverage for second-tier languages for your agent. So let's say that the primary users of your agent, or what we would call first-tier users of your agent, are mainly going to speak in English and in French. So therefore, I can choose to do manual translation there, but then let's say that I wanted to also support Spanish and Portuguese. Well, for me to be able to support those, it might be better for me if I support those in a second tier language type of approach where I use machine translation so I don't have as much cost associated with having to do the manual translation myself. So just be aware that that is going to be one of the factors that a lot of people go after to be able to figure out, am I willing to make that investment for manual translation? Is it worth the investment for me to do it? Or is it something I want to come up with a machine translation way of doing it? Now, the other thing as we find is that there are certain scenarios where you might even have a live agent in the loop. And if you have a live agent and your live agent may not be able to speak the language that the human is speaking on the other side, you having this in the center allows us to be able to translate not just what the agent is saying that is the machine agent, but also the live agent as well. So this is going to be a very much a pattern that we see a lot of people going after. And a lot of the different contact center scenarios implement this capability for you. So just be aware of that. And then lastly, a main reason people like to do this is it really saves cost for them. It makes it where you don't have to spend quite as much money to have manual translations and maintain those and all of the different configurations and things. And so time is money and money is time. So when we look at that, it actually can provide you a much more cost-effective solution, assuming that you're good with the quality that comes out the backside of this. And that quality is improving over time because of the invention of large language models that are multilingual capable. So just be aware that you really should be evaluating this and figuring out what is the right way to go about that. And yes, you can choose a different large language model that's doing your summarization from the one that's doing the translation work. So just be aware, these are going to be common things or reasons why you'll do machine translation. All right, so now let's dive into machine translation a little further because it's probably the option that most people are interested in. But when we look at this, we have really got two different ways that we can go. We can go the Azure Translation Services route, or we can go the large language models route. And when we go and say that we want to do, let's say the Azure Translation Services option, what we're going to have there is we're going to have the ability to have a relay agent as an example. So what that means is that I can make an agent that intercepts everything that sits in front of Copilot Studio and does the translation using Azure Translation Services. Now, the benefit of this is that you can translate to languages that Copilot Studio doesn't even support. And the language setting that we were talking about before is kind of irrelevant because it's doing it as an appliance inside or in front of your particular agent. Now, there's some negatives with this because of the fact that you do need to think about the fact that it's going to be its own service and it's its own thing. So you need to make sure that you're aware of what's going on. Now, the beauty of it is there is an actual implementation of this that has been put out on the Copilot Studio samples GitHub repo that our PowerCat team has put together and made available. So if you're really interested in a relay agent, know that you can go download that from the GitHub samples repo and get a hold of it. Now, the other option is that you can also use a connector in the back end. So you could say, I want to take the connector as a service and just be able to go grab that connector and be able to do a quick translation of anything that you really want. And so just be aware that that is also an option that a lot of people may decide that they want to use, but it's just a basic translate this particular string using Azure Translation Services. One thing to note is Azure Translation Services is really good because it can give you the ability to say, here are common words that maybe are in your own custom dictionary. So there's a lot of value in Azure Translation Services. So definitely take a look at that. And if you have a lot of custom language that you're using and things of that nature, know that you would either have to do that in a prompt whenever you go to machine translation, but Azure Translation Services gives you an interface to be able to do that natively within its service itself. Now let's talk about large language models. Now in large language models, we have the ability to generate a response. And so this is going to give us the ability to say, let's actually change the response and generate it in a different language. Now we can do that within the prompt itself, or we can actually also do that and say that I would like to translate something that's already been given back. So an example of that is you could generate a response using GPT-4.1, but then turn around and use Grok 3 to translate that by passing it through the response that you got back or the summarization text in through Grok 3 through a prompt before you actually send it back out. So if there's an opportunity there for you to look at that, now you're paying double fees when you do things like this. So it would be something that you would only want to do if you really felt like there was a value proposition for you. Otherwise, when you generate the response, you can say, translate this to what system.user.language is, and you can make it where it will automatically translate or give it back to the user in the language that the agent is intending to speak. So just know that you can do that, as well as you can also go and translate scripted responses. So if you have scripted responses, then in your actual implementation of the topic or where you're scripting your response, you can actually pass it back through a prompt to be able to get it translated. A lot of common ways that people do that is they create a topic for translation, and then they just reuse that topic over and over to be able to pass it through a prompt to be able to get a translated version that's being used in a consistent fashion without having to do that prompt engineering for every single topic. So just know that these are going to be little tricks that you can do with machine translation. So now that we've kind of covered the different ways that we can do translation, one of the questions a lot of people have is, can Copilot Studio just figure out which language someone's talking to it and automatically detect that? And while it can't do that by default, a little trick that Gary Pretty taught me, who's one of the people you guys should totally go follow on LinkedIn and things of that nature, but he kind of came to me and said, hey, you know what? What if we used a language model to auto-detect what the language was that someone was speaking, and then auto-go change the way that it's set inside of Copilot Studio? Well, to give you guys some gifts and things from me, I went ahead and built you a sample of this and made it available on the GitHub samples repo for Copilot Studio. For the PowerCat team. So if you're interested in this, make sure you check the comments and you can go get a hold of this thing. I'm not going to go into extreme depth here, but I'll give you a high level of how this is going to work, because there will be a dedicated video that I'm building for you guys on exactly how to use this sample and how it works. But let's try to dive in really quick to how it actually works on the back end so you can get the concept of how you can play with multi-language inside of Copilot Studio. So if we first understand how Copilot Studio actually works when we think about the way the orchestration layers work, you'll see that how this actually works is after it goes and it figures out a plan to be able to respond, what it's going to do is it's going to generate a response. But what we want to think about is how can we intercept and be able to take care of this, because the user has spoken in. So how do we intercept before the plan is generated or before we even get started to be able to tell it what language the user's speaking? So let's look at where we can go and do that within this whole process. So basically, if we break this down, now that we know that we want to be able to intercept the user message that's coming in, to understand how to modify it, to be able to tell Copilot Studio to say, hey, this is actually in this particular language, and go set the user.language setting inside of Copilot Studio. The way that you can do that is there is a trigger called a message is received. And a message is received is when the actual message comes in from the user. So this gives us the ability to build basically a middleware component that we can go put into Copilot Studio. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use that trigger to be able to say, hey, when I get a message, what I want you to do is I want you to go run this prompt to detect what language it is and set the user.language setting inside of Copilot Studio equal to that particular language. So for us to be able to go and do that, we need to be able to use a prompt to be able to analyze it, and we need to intercept that message up front so that way Copilot Studio is actually changing its entire settings across the board, not just doing it just for that single particular tool or something of that nature. It's going to affect the entire product whenever we do this, or the entire agent implementation that you have. So by doing this, you end up with a very unique capability, because not only is it a situation where I can detect the language on default, I can also, in the middle of the conversation, switch from English to Spanish, for example, And all of a sudden, the agent will talk back to me how I'm talking to it. And so you end up with this full auto detect capability. And meanwhile, you haven't broken anything inside of Copilot Studio, because Copilot Studio fundamentally is using that system.user.language variable to be able to determine what language it should be talking in. So this doesn't break anything inside of Copilot Studio and is the proper way to actually do auto detection of language inside of Copilot Studio. Well, I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. I was really looking forward to doing this one for you guys. And if you like videos like this or you want more like them, make sure you like and subscribe to my channel. And as always, you can try Copilot Studio at aka.ms/try Copilot Studio.